Guahan is back in order. We're still in second reading. We are now on item number 5, Bill 145. Senator Nelson, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I move to resolve into Committee of the Whole for the purpose of deliberating and addressing matters on Bill 145-34 COR as corrected by the Prime Sponsor, and that as the committee chair the Committee of the Whole and invite the following Guam Housing Corporation members. How many of us are?
Is there an objection? We stand in recess to bring in the individuals that you wish to call.
The Committee of the Whole is now in order. Just a few rules of engagement, colleagues. What I'll do is I'll allow the panel to introduce themselves. I'll give a brief history so the people kind of understand what this bill is and the intent. And then any questions that you have, you can address me or the panel, and the panel is open to answering these questions that you pose. Okay? So I'd like to invite the president of Guam Housing Corporation to first introduce, and then everyone just feel free to follow suit. Thank you.
Good morning, Senators and Madam Chair. My name is Chris Duenas. I am the president of the Guam Housing Corporation.
Good morning, Senators, Madam Chair. My name is Cesar Villanueva, Special Assistant to the President, Guam Housing Corporation.
Good morning, Senators. I am, Madam Chair, I'm Clyde Beaver from Guam Housing Corporation. I'm the Quality Assurance Officer.
Good morning, Senators. My name is Mary Guerrero. I'm the Loan Administrator for Guam Housing Administration.
Thank you. I'd like to thank the Guam Housing Corporation members for being present today and being open to discussing some of the questions that we may have. Also, I'd like to state for the record that they have been previously sworn in. Bill 145-34 is an act to repeal subsection 41004 Alpha 4 and Alpha 5 of Article 10, Chapter 4, Title 12, and to repeal and reenact subsection 20101 of Chapter 20, Title 11, all of Guam Code annotated, relative to removing the requirement that the Guam Housing Corporation appropriate a sum certain from its revenues to ensure a reserve balance every fiscal year, and to authorizing fees imposed on the sale and transfer of interest on real property to be deposited into the Housing Trust Fund program. The legislative findings and intent, y legislator en Guahan finds that the implementation of Public Law 31-166, known as the Housing Trust Fund Act, enacted in January 2012, recognized the need to support the accessibility and affordability of housing for the residents of Guam, and to assist by providing financial support services for low to moderate income households in order to achieve their dream of obtaining affordable housing. Y legislator en Guahan also recognizes that among the primary concerns realized by the Guam Housing Corporation is the fundamental issue of obtaining lending capital for affordable housing, which is generally too expensive or unavailable. The Guam Housing Corporation has a waiting list of prospective first-time home borrowers, wherein the number of prospective borrowers exceeds the amount of funding available, and where these qualified borrowers are otherwise unable to obtain mortgage financing elsewhere, so unable to obtain mortgage financing through the traditional routes of going to a bank. Il legislator en Guahan has further determined that the Guam Housing Corporation on its own is unable to meet the ongoing needs and demands from the funds they provide from their annual budget as mandated under Public Law 31-166, without jeopardizing its current fiscal responsibilities to the corporation. Il legislator en Guahan further finds that the funding for this program or other authorized programs pursuant to the Housing Trust Fund shall be identified by the Guam Housing Corporation, but subject to legislative approval by Il legislator en Guahan. Il legislator en Guahan acknowledges that by maintaining a viable lending program for Guam's low to moderate income families, the Guam Housing Corporation has sought out sources of lending capital from traditional lending institutions like Citibank, Bank of Guam, and Federal Home Loan Bank of Seattle, and by floating a mortgage revenue. All of these lending sources have either been too expensive or require specific conditions, creating obstacles under the lending program, resulting in the funds or programs to remain out of reach for many of Guam residents in achieving their dream of purchasing their first home. Y legislator en Guahan also finds that Guam Housing Corporation encountered many hurdles arising out of the limited activity from the mortgage revenue bond and from the restrictive requirements of Federal Home Loan Bank of Seattle, which strictly prohibited the corporation from packaging loans which they serviced to Freddie Mac or other prospective investors. Y legislator en Guahan finds that throughout the nation there are over 625 successful housing trust fund programs that have implemented the exact program or programs based on the sources of funding identified herein. So this is nothing new. This is not something that we've created. This is something that is also practiced in other states. And we are moving forward to try to find a sustainable way to maintain this program for our working families. Funds collected from the funding sources identified herein shall be deposited into the Housing Trust Fund program and may be used as lending capital or for other programs administered by the Guam Housing Corporation in accordance with the Housing Trust Fund administrative rules and regulations adopted therein. Now, therefore, it is the intent of E Legislator and Guahan to repeal the provisions of the Housing Trust Fund, requiring the Guam Housing Corporation to appropriate $250,000 from its annual operating revenues to ensure that a reserve balance is maintained at the beginning of each fiscal year. E Legislator further finds to provide additional sources of funding to qualified first-time homeowners and their families with the assistance of the Housing Trust Fund by authorizing the transfer of monies collected on fees imposed on real property, conveyed or sold in Guam, to be deposited into the Housing Trust Fund, into the Housing Trust Program. Subsection 41004 Alpha 4 and Alpha 5 of Article 10, Chapter 4, Title 12, Guam Code Annotated, are hereby repealed as follows. So we repealed these sections, and we added Section 3, the compiler of laws shall redesignate 41004 Alpha 6 of Article 10, Chapter 4, Title 12, Guam Code Annotated accordingly. Section 4, subsection 20101 of Chapter 20, Title 11, Guam Code Annotated is hereby repealed and reenacted as follows. The focus is subsection 20101, realty conveyance amount. A tax is established on all conveyances, deeds, instruments, or writings whereby any land, tenements, or other realty shall be sold, granted, transferred, or otherwise conveyed to the purchaser or purchasers or to any other persons designated by such purchaser or purchasers as follows. Subsection A, 2 and 50 / $100, so it'll be $2.50 for each $1,000 or fraction thereof on the true consideration or value received for such realty of any transaction less than $1 million. So this remains the same. The change, provided such fee be collected by the gross amount of the consideration and remitted to the Department of Land Management. So this will go to the Department of Land Management. $11.50 for each $1,000 or fraction thereof true consideration value received by such realty of all transactions over $1 million or greater. So just to be clear, this is the meat of the bill, is that for any property sold that is over $1 million, for every $1,000, $11.50 fee will be tacked on. 3, let me find it. Provided such fee be collected on the gross amount of the consideration from the collected of these fees, $3.50 for each $1,000 collected on all transactions over $1 million and greater shall be to the Department of Land Management, $8 for each $1,000 collected on all transactions over $1 million and greater shall be remitted to the Housing Trust Fund as established under Article 10 of Chapter 4, Title 12 GCA, and used in accordance with the administrative rules and regulations of the Housing Trust Fund program. So that gives you the breakdown of where the $11.50 will go for every $1,000 of the transaction. So $3.50 will go to Department of Land Management, and then $8 will be transferred into the Guam Housing Corporation. Payment of these fees, whether conducted by a realtor, private attorney, private parties, or by any other means that real property on Guam may be transferred, shall be collected from the escrow agent or escrow company handling the transaction and remitted to the Department of Land Management and Guam Housing Corporation's Housing Trust Fund program in accordance with this provision. This act shall be effective upon enactment. And just a little bit of history. For those that are watching, the Housing Trust Fund is in all 50 states. It's available in every major city and county. The legislature has acted on this historically, and it has always been a desire from members of the bodies in the previous legislatures to find and seek sources of funding for the Guam Housing Trust Fund, because with the understanding that it helps the people of Guam, our working families, achieve their dream of purchasing a home. So the First Time Homeowners Relief Program Act was started in 1998. This is when everything came into fruition. However, 20 years before or so, this was already enacted within the mainland through the efforts of Dr. Martin Luther King and some other members in the community that were always advocating for the people. In 1998, Public Law 24-180 was enacted by Senator Dr. John Salas, Senator Ben Pangilinan Defuntu, and Senator Speaker Judith Wanpat. The funding source, of course, after 6 months dried up immediately because there was no continual funding source. So whatever money they had at that time for the working class people who could not get the traditional loan from the bank, they were able to meet the needs for only 6 months for them to be able to perhaps provide money for closing costs and so forth. So after that period in 1998, the Housing Trust Fund program remained dormant until 2012. And then once again, Senator Ben Pangilinan, through the Housing Trust Fund Act, also found another source, but again, that source was exhausted within 6 months. So as we see, the depletion of these revenues shows just in a 6-month period that there are a lot of people on Guam that do desire to own a home. And many times our mortgages are the cost of a rent. And so there's a long list, a waiting list of people who would like to avail themselves to owning a home, and they are working class families. Then, of course, again in the future, I believe it was in the 32nd Guam Legislature, Speaker Wanpat found a creative source of revenue through the escheated funds. And of course, the Guam Housing Corporation members can give us a status report on where we are at with the escheated funds and how many people it did service. I just want to remind our colleagues that the Housing Trust Fund is a source for our working class families who are unable to get loans from banks, and usually you have to get denied 3 times, which is a very humbling experience for if you are seeking to find a home, and then go and seek assistance through the Housing Trust Fund program. But the Housing Trust Fund program really brings back the hope of our local families being able to own and purchase a home. This is a great program. The members are here today to answer any of your questions about the program, and even if the questions may seem a little bit simple or simplistic, I invite you to ask the question, because the people of Guam also need to know that this is an opportunity open to them. So I'd like to open up the floor to my colleagues, and if you have any questions that you'd like to ask, please feel free to do so at this time. Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Okay, just one thing, there is a waiting list now, and some of the questions that came to me was, what was the current waiting list? And there was one more thing I spoke to you about that one of my colleagues asked me this morning. So can you just say that, Mr. Beaver, and then colleagues, please feel free to ask a question.
Yeah, a couple of things. We have received over $3 million so far in escheated funds. We have issued out grant program money to 398 families. We have 12 that's committed, that's not yet funded. We have 28 on the waiting list. So we still have a pent-up demand. We find ourselves short right now about $77,000 just to meet the commitments of this particular program. And we have other programs that we're trying to put into place as well. So,
also, this program does help to help with infrastructure. So perhaps some of us have land and it's far away from the resources of infrastructure. This program also allows the the family that is looking to build a home on their private property the opportunity to find sources of getting water and sewer and power to them. We'll also be passing out this, the history of the fund that Mr. Clyde Beaver just spoke about. This is the escheated funds from Speaker Juan Pat's previous bill in the 32nd. So, Mr. Speaker, I think did you have something?
For the listening audience, maybe you might explain what's the maximum grant that you can provide? Can a first-time owner go in and borrow $1 million or? No, I know. You said that you can be as simple as possible, but I think it's important that we know what the parameters are, or at least the listening audience knows what the max they could be asking for.
The first-time down payment program has a cap on the cost, which is $250,000. From that total maximum amount, 4% is allowed and will be funded under the first-time homeowner assistance program. So the maximum is $10,000 per applicant.
You can lend them $10,000 for their down payment.
It could be used for a down payment or any of their closing costs that they would incur: appraisal, your closing fees that are assessed by the banks, your required insurance, your preliminary title report, anything associated with you getting that loan from the bank or from any of our participating lenders.
And that's to purchase a home with a maximum value of $250,000.
Cost, not the value. The value could be more than that because the appraisal could be substantially higher than what their costs will if they own the land. So the total cost, to include the closing fees that the banks will provide the applicant. So that fee plus your total cost, whether you're buying land, you're building, or purchasing an existing home, cannot exceed $250,000, which translates to $10,000 per individual to receive in the form of a grant.
And with the current H2 situation and the cost of construction having gone up, has the Housing Corporation noticed whether or not the more people are able to, or whether or not there's even any contractors that are willing to build anything that small?
If I may, Mr. Speaker, we did submit a bill to increase it to the cost to be $300,000. So we have yet to hear that bill. But however, the same funding amount is still $10,000. So that does not change, but just to increase the cost, because we did recognize that the value of homes are going up. And so in an effort to meet what is happening in the market and also the construction costs, we wanted to also add that bill in there. But at the rate that the Guam Housing Corporation is right now, they are still only able to give at the maximum amount $10,000 for whatever closing cost or down payment.
Interesting. So there's been you haven't seen a noticeable effect of the number of people applying has gone down then, or being able to move forward with construction? Are people still constructing as many small homes now, individual homes, as there are? Really? That's great.
Yes.
And purchase, Mr. Speaker. Right now the latest mean average that we came out was $210,000, and so we're seeing loans for purchase. Some of these folks are buying, fixer-uppers and things like that. So in the range of $175,000, $200,000. So those applicants are coming to us for the lending capital as well as to avail themselves of the first-time homeowners program for the down payment assistance and the like. I believe our cap is $270,000 for our actual lending capital in terms of what we would lend up to. So yeah, we don't finance million-dollar homes or things like that. Our clientele, of course, are rejected by a conventional financial institution first in order to come and seek our assistance. So most of them are not even in the range of purchasing a home above mean, really. Most of them are purchasing in the area or building in the area of somewhere around $175,000 to $250,000.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does any of my colleagues have any questions? Yes, Senator Castro.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have a question for the panel. Reference on page 2, lines 14 and 15, you explicitly state having solicited from a number of banks, and I see one locally chartered bank. Are you aware of any other locally or regionally chartered banks? And is there a reason why we have or have not solicited for their participation as well?
Yeah, we have talked to a number of banks, but the big thing is that the cost of the money is greater than what our return would be. We tried it with the Federal Home Loan Bank. We tried it with the Citibank. We tried it with the Bank of Guam, and in all cases, the cost of that money is greater than what we can get a return on our loans. That was pretty much the corporation's downfall in the late 90s. We almost went out of business in the late 90s because our debt load was just higher than what we could handle. So we figured out then that we had to change our way of doing business. We couldn't keep borrowing money to loan money. Now, I know that we went through the proposal of trying to sell our loans to Freddie Mac or Fannie Mae, and our loans are not quality enough for these folks. The mortgage revenue bond kind of proved that out back in 1998. And that put us out of reach for a lot of our borrowers because they couldn't meet their requirements. So we just don't meet the test of local banks what they want. We can't borrow money, we can't pay it back. And when most banks want short-term money, or we loan it for long-term mortgages, it just doesn't work. We tried it.
If I could add, Senator, I've been approached by a couple of different bankers to discuss our portfolio, possibly, give us additional lending capital via assuming, some of our loans. Problem is, of course, they're in business, so they want to take our good loans, and while that would give us additional lending capital, to service those who are in a waiting list, it's not prudent because we would lose our revenue generator, which is the interest income that we currently have. So there are offers out there from time to time, in terms of traditional lending institutions trying to work with us. But right now, the points are just not far enough away, really. And, with the record low interest rates, in fact, our success story, as Mary would put it all the time, is that we have had a number of good loans that have been refinanced in traditional financial institutions because these folks have gotten on their feet. They've performed very well. Their credit rating has increased tremendously and become very good. And so at that point, they go out there and they get a much lower interest loan, and we lose that interest income. But, hey, that's our success story. That's what we're there for, is to get folks on their feet and get them moving along. So good question in terms of opportunities. It's just the margins and the points the way they are right now. We can't buy money and turn around and sell it at a rate to generate the proper income.
Also, because the nature of our business, right, of course, if we collateralize $1 million, they're not going to give us $1 million in lending capital. It's going to be at a lower amount that we would have to pledge. Now, if the interest is passed on to Guam Housing at, let's say, 6%, And we are allowed in our mandate to add 2% on top of that. Now that translates to a 7% loan to our constituents. And that's not going to help any when we're trying to equal or at least try to address what's out there in inventory that they can buy, they can build. So at the end of the day, if we're mindful that whatever costs of the funds that we need for lending capital has to be at the lowest cost, because that will be passed on. And that would mean less of a loan amount for them to qualify. And then they won't be able to find anything out there in the market to buy. And that's already happening in ours. Even with us reducing our rates to a point above prevailing rate, even that, because our mandate requires to serve a group of individuals within a certain income, even if it's 200% of the median, even that with their current obligations gives them very limited qualifying amount for them to go out there. And that's where we're at some of our waiting lists. They've been identified as qualified. They're just not coming back because they haven't found anything to purchase if they don't own land. And if they do own land, then they're out there looking now what would meet their family needs to build a house. Thank you.
I'd like to welcome Department of Land Management Director, Mr. Barr. Thank you for coming.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair, and those were great responses. And so, first of all, I didn't open by thanking you, thanking the author for the initiative. A couple follow-up questions. Do we anticipate under the current administration any change that would create maybe a less of a risk or a more a greater climate for that kind of an investment for local banks? That's the first question. And then I have another one. The next question would be, would there be another opportunity going forward to kind of create the proper investment climate for local and regional banking institutions to participate? I've been fairly consistent in my position as a senator to encourage us to buy local, invest local, think regional, and act regionally. And so my third question would be, and maybe we could put our heads together to at least list for the record what the locally and or regionally chartered banks are, because I am extremely happy that we do have one of our larger locally chartered institutions participating, but I like to see more of them getting involved if it's a good return on their investment and the people's investment before we look further northwest like Seattle. No offense to the Seattle banking industry, but I think we have capable and probably even institutions that could carry that kind of risk capacity. So,
I think I have an answer that might hit all three, as we've talked about this in our team meetings.
Yeah.
Recently, with the passage of on the federal level, of course, with the tax reductions, corporate tax, as well as folks seeing more in their paychecks, we actually see this opportunity that we at the corporation and working with our people, we think we're one of the government economic drivers. We believe with people having more income in their pocket, as well as corporations probably looking to reinvest the capital that they realize from the tax reductions, that they would invest in real estate, maybe affordable homes. And so, Senator, as the margins change maybe with a very robust economy stateside, if it really takes off the way it's predicted, there might be that spread and that situation. Now, the one thing I did say to financial institutions, of course, and I would work with the legislature on this, is maybe when we have a dedicated funding source and we look good and we're generating this revenue, the government of Guam, the full faith in the government of Guam with this funding source becomes a loan guarantee, so that we're not just a first-time homeowner or a program having been rejected by a bank, but for those folks that are actually just on the cusp of being qualified, and the bank maybe doesn't want to say no, and they'll say, I'll take that risk, but Guam Housing also, the government of Guam would enter into an opportunity for being a loan guarantee. And so I think that really is the kind of interface that we could have in the future with the traditional lending institutions for affordable housing. Like I said, you all know the real estate's gone up 20, 30, 50% in some instances because of the, a couple different factors. One is, of course, the labor shortage and the inventory, but the other is just generally the economy. And so the mean is moving up. And so there may be an opportunity for that in the future, but we believe that this is the key to Guam Housing once again becoming a service provider and a player in the finance industry because there is a dedicated funding source. So all of what you spoke of, Senator, are opportunities, but without a real solid dedicated funding source, it really is kind of just a dream at that point.
Well, thank you. So I just want to commend the panel for their subject matter expertise. My confidence is there with the internal capacity of the Housing Corporation, so thank you. Follow-up question would be, is there a rationale behind the $250 for every dollar up to $1 million and then from the million and above to $1150? I guess that's, I don't know, 5 times the amount. I mean, is there a rationale behind that?
Yeah, if you look at the first, well, you wouldn't have this available, but the first proposal was benchmarked against models stateside, and it was really quite a bit higher, actually. It was up at around $1,750. You see in places like Seattle and some of the other big cities where, there's a lot of income and a lot of capital. And so, that's what they charge, the cost of doing business in order to be able to help their people. Of course, that we believed, and we worked with the real estate community and the like, and businesses, that would have been a deal breaker, we believe. And so this 1150, Senator, was arrived at as a compromise to that number. And just to do some rough math, it was at $500,000 when we first tried to launch this program. We realized that was a deal breaker too, especially like I said, the mean is going up. So 500,000 maybe in a few years is going to be almost a regular home, right? So we also said, we can't do that. We've got to go to $1 million because we believe somebody investing in $1 million home. The quick math on that is if you were to record in today's money $1 million home at $250 per $1,000, you would pay $2,500 in recordation. We have a slides available to show some of these breakdowns. If at $1,150 you'd pay, I think it's $11,500. So we think somebody paying an extra $9,000 on $1 million home is not a deal breaker for them. We believe that somebody with a capital of $1 million to build a home can absorb a $9,000 increase in recordation and without it being a major hit on the economy. We believe that above $1 million with big investors and the like, the economic impact study and others will show that we just don't believe that somebody's not going to come to Guam and do a hotel or a big project or anything else because of the fact that the recordation fee went up. We believe that investors are investing worldwide and they understand that in certain jurisdictions, definitely in a U.S. jurisdiction, it's a cost of doing business. So if they want to do business in the United States via Guam or anywhere else, if they were going to invest in Seattle or Hawaii or New York, they would pay a recordation fee much higher than what Guam's proposing if they were to do business nationally.
Thank you, Madam Chair. In consideration of my colleagues and giving them equal opportunity to ask questions, maybe I could take this offline with you, Senator, in terms of your scale that you referred to and in terms of you alluding to a compromise with those who have $1 million homes or greater for investments. And so I'd like to further explore the rationale and how you compromise that. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Castro. Senator Lee and then Senator Nicholas.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you all for being here to answer our questions. I want to congratulate you on some of the success stories that you were talking about, and I really want to commend the mover of this measure for introducing this and identifying this source for this housing trust fund. I think we're all in agreement that, first-time home buyers, it's a really important thing. We want to make sure that we give our families an opportunity to be in their own home and to be able to thrive in our community. My question to you is, I just wanted to know what the trust fund balance might be, because we've been given this first-time home buyers assistance program funds available, and it shows that there's 28 folks on your waiting list with maybe $77,000 shortage, but what about the trust fund balance?
Let me address that if I could. See, the big thing here is we're talking about one particular program, which is the first-time homeowner program.
Right.
What we're looking at here is when we put the administrative rules together, we identified about 12 to 14 programs that need to be addressed. And the Housing Trust Fund program can be used towards addressing those issues. One of them is homeless, one of them is infrastructure, one of them is lending capital. And it goes on and on and on. So what we're trying to do here is not just fund the first-time homeowner program, we're trying to fund all housing programs that we can identify. And all these programs, as we have one right now in place we cannot fund, is the Housing First program. There's a law on the books that says to help homeless folks. We can't do that because there's no funds to do that. These funds here could be earmarked towards, or some of these funds could be channeled to these programs. Other parts of these funds can be channeled to lending capital for our lower income folks that the banks won't finance, for homes that might be not concrete, but maybe other structures, alternative building systems that banks won't finance. So these are all the things that we're trying to do with the trust fund. The first-time homeowner program was a really good test. We put that together back in '98, and it failed because the financing fell through. We brought it back together again in 2012, and we put up $500,000 of our own money to prove that it would work. And we went out of money within 5 months. So then we went to find other sources of money. Well, we're still running short of money here too, but what we need, and what we're looking for here, is a continual funding source. We have it here. The system has been in place since 1972 across the country. We've been working on it here since 1998, and it's time that we get on board and do something, because we know that we can make it work.
I understand. Okay, so you're looking towards a more sustainable and something that's going to be a consistent funding source. I'm just concerned that maybe my colleagues or other folks in the community might look at some of the other numbers that you've given over to us or have made public, and they might see some of these leftover or unused funds, and there's still people on the waiting list. There's still 28 families out there that we haven't necessarily serviced, and then there might be funds left over that we might be able to use, or I'm not sure if it's restricted, so if you could just clarify, I'd appreciate it.
Sure, Senator. So I understand your question as well, and I know that Clyde was enumerating on the need for sustainability. So we're subject to the distributions and from Department of Administration as they accumulate the escheated funds. That is the dedicated funding source passed by Speaker Wampat as well as the late Senator Speaker Ben. So that is a fluctuating fund amount. As Mary would tell you, people are a lot smarter these days. They're not allowing dormant accounts to just sit around and everything else, and they're realizing that the government will go in and take that money if they don't activate that account or do something with it. So we have a graph that will show you it's a declining number, but the direct answer to your question is we will always have a waiting list without a dedicated funding source, because we're at the mercy of Department of Administration doing their reconciliation and distributing us the funds that are available via the escheated funds. That really is the only trust fund balance. We are not allowed to commingle our operational funds with that.
To your knowledge, has any of those escheated funds ever been withheld by Department of Administration? No. Have they ever not given you the full amount?
No. We put in our request and our recommendation as required, and the distributions are given.
100%.
100%. And keep in mind, Senator, also that in this instance, the banks are the ones who take into consideration, as well as us doing the financing, they're the ones who take into consideration what weight that impact of the payment has on the financing. So once they're approved, most financial institutions will go ahead and do the financing, even if it requires a reimbursement. So they will do that a lot of times, and they'll do the full funding for the construction or the purchase. And then what they will do is they will take the distribution as it comes to Guam Housing, and we cut the check through the title company, and they will handle that entire transaction, and they will do the reimbursement as prepared. So that's why we don't stop. We keep the pipeline going. We keep taking applications and the like. But as the funds become available, we distribute. And but it's, you know, this program now has helped 506 families realize the dream of home ownership. It is over well, yeah, we have a disparity and a inter-family dispute about when the program started in 1998 and then when we actually had a dedicated funding source was this cheated. So yes, overall 585, 506 given the 1998 program that rolled out and then became defunct. So 585 families who have realized that dream of home ownership through this program. So it's over $100 million of economic activity through just around $4 million plus lending or grant program capital. So, but the direct answer to your question is we request immediately to the Department of Administration when those grants are required, and if they don't have the money, they let us know and they say we're still reconciling accounts and we'll get it to you when we can. But the financial institutions carry the weight most of the time. If the loan is good, they'll issue the money, they'll do the transaction, and they'll wait for the full faith of Guam Housing to remit that grant.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Lee. Senator Nicholas.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a number of questions. On page 4, lines 9 through 17, the portion of the law that's being struck through and replaced, the $2.50 for each $1,000 or fraction thereof, where does that $2.50 go currently?
That currently goes to the Department of Land Management. It's been on the books for a long time.
So this is not this amount is not received at all by the Guam Housing Corporation?
No, it is not.
So this goes to DLM. And the reason why I wanted to clarify that is because in the new language, Section A does remit $2.50. It does specify that it goes to the Department of Land Management. It's not in that particular section there, though. Test. It's not in that particular section there, though. So was that amount being appropriated, or is there some other language in some other section of law that is sending that $2.50 to DLM?
That $2.50 is part of the Land Survey Revolving Fund. It's part of the fee schedule normally for the Land Survey Revolving Fund.
So just for clarification's purposes, perhaps should we remit the funds to the Land Survey Revolving Fund in the measure as opposed to saying remitted to the Department of Land Management? Because it almost sounds like a direct appropriation as opposed to an appropriation from the fund. Because in the budget, that's where we would appropriate from the fund. But by writing it this way, saying it's remitted to the Department of Land Management, it's almost a direct appropriation from the transaction to DLM as opposed to into the fund, and then from the fund in the budget to DLM. So, Madam Chair, perhaps an advised amendment that the on page 5, section A, lines 1 and 2, instead of it saying remitted to Department of Land Management, it should be remitted to the Land Survey Revolving Fund. Just for clarification, because it's all about the accounting purposes.
Colleagues, we have an amendment proposed by Senator Nicholas. Can you just repeat it one more time, please?
To the Land Survey Revolving Fund, and Madam Chair, I'm just bringing this up for notation purposes, and then I guess we can work on the specifics of the amendment at a later time. But I just wanted to just highlight that we're going to change that section there.
Sure.
That's also going to need to be consistent in Section B. Because again, in Section B, line 11, it remits it directly to the Department of Land Management. That needs to go again also into the Land Survey Revolving Fund. And then another question I had on that particular portion there, lines 8 through 11 on page 4. The fee is different. It's $2.50 for everything up to $1 million, but then it goes to $3.50. For anything over $1 million, and I wanted to ask why why is land management getting more money on a $1 million transaction versus anything below $1 million?
Senator, we, of course, I'm sure Mike would want to jump in on that too. We recognize the, the day-to-day operations and duties and responsibilities at land management, and especially the Land Survey Revolving Fund and other activities that they have with Chamorro Land Trust and the like. We included them in this legislation simply because they are our partners and they do a lot of work. Of course, you're aware of the work that they do, and they have been looking in the past. I know they've worked with their chairman and others to explore their fees and to allow for them to continue to do additional surveying and all the other work that they do. And so this is an opportunity for both land management as well as Guam Housing to have capital to do our jobs.
I appreciate the transparency. I would prefer that. I mean, if the intent of the increase is to have more grants for the Guam Housing Trust Fund, that the $2.50 remains consistent, whether it's up to $1 million or over $1 million, and the extra dollar goes into the trust fund. I mean, that's the whole point of why we're having the conversation. So that's another notation that I would like to make, Madam Chair, with respect to potential amendments. Another concern I wanted to raise was on page 4, lines 15 to 17. The fee was provided that in the sales of encumbered property, the tax shall be collected on the net amount of the consideration after deducting the amount of the encumbrance. That language is no longer in the new language. And so the fee was going to be assessed net of encumbrance. And so if you had a $1 million property or a $500,000 property and you had a $400,000 loan on the property, when you sold the property for $500,000, you would pay the $2.50 on the $100,000 net of encumbrance. By removing that net of encumbrance language, you're going to be causing the individual selling the property to pay a higher fee and result in a lower net on their sales. And so if the intent is to to create a lower cost housing market opportunity, I think that if we take out that net of encumbrance language, we may drive prices higher. And so that's another notation, Madam Chair, that I would like to make. We should consider making this net of encumbrance, so that if people are selling a house to somebody else, they're not going to jack up the price more because it's net of, because it's gross instead of net.
I know that the practice is the gross amount. It always has been the gross amount. And I know we've discussed this before about the net. It's been recommended to me before that we continued at the gross. And in my experience, it's always been a gross. Can you hear me now? Okay, I'm sorry. Now, it's been my experience that we've always used the gross. We've talked about this before because of exactly your reason right there. The return, of course, will be less to the fund. I don't have any real good explanation as to why, I know it'd be a benefit to have have the fee on a lower amount, but I know that a lot of other fees are based on this net amount. But we also look at taking care of the fund, making sure the fund is funded. And it has never been an issue before any place in my experience. And so I thought, well, why make it an issue now? I've been told that we should use the gross amount. I think it leads to the gross amount. And when the dust settles, it's still not that great of an amount. So I'd like to keep it there. That's my comments on that. But.
I appreciate that. I'm just referring to what's in the statute And what's already in the statute is it's supposed to be the net amount of the consideration after deducting the amount of the encumbrance. And so if that's what it's supposed to be, then that's what should be being done already. I hope we're not collecting on the gross amount total, because then we have a lot of rebates that we have to go and give back to people. But I would like that language to be included and carried over into the new language, because again, it would, just by my evaluation, it would make the prices go up, because the seller would have to factor in the gross amount as opposed to the net amount. They would have to factor that into they would have to factor in the cost of their existing encumbrances. And we're not trying to make prices higher, we're trying to keep them as low as possible, at least in the spirit of this discussion. My other question, Madam Chair, so that's a third amendment I would like to recommend. The first is that make it land survey revolving fund. The second is keep it at 250 across the board, and the third is carry over the net of the net amount of consideration. My other question, Madam Chair, and I'm going to beg your indulgence because I'm not as familiar with this section of the code. Is there a section anywhere else in this code that creates an exemption? There's no exemptions. And so I had another question. This amount is supposed to be a tax on all conveyances, deeds, instruments, or writings. And so when somebody does a deed of gift of property from one family member to another, I mean, technically it's not a sale, but the property is changing hand, it's being transferred. And so is that tax being assessed on deeds of gift? I don't want it to be. And the reason why I'm bringing it up is I just want to make sure that maybe we need to create an exemption section. And so I wanted to pose the question, are deeds of gift being assessed this tax?
Presently, no, because there's no affidavit of true consideration that's provided to determine that amount. Many deeds do not express the true amount of the sale.
Right.
That amount is expressed in an affidavit of true consideration, which is not a recorded document, but a document supplied directly for the Department of Revenue and Taxation's purposes. So it's based on that. If you did the math on the recordation fee that gets applied, you could assume what the amount of the true consideration was, because it's not public record. But currently, no, deeds of gifts are not assessed for the value of the property that's been exchanged.
Yeah, that's just a concern I have, because it's not the law. The existing language is kind of ambiguous. And that, I think that needs to be clarified. And on that, in the spirit of that also, is this tax being assessed on probated properties that are being probated out from the courts? So when an estate is being probated, are we tagging on this tax? And is the estate having to pay a tax on that with respect to this?
May I say a couple things here? One is we put the floor at $1 million to eliminate the majority of the market. And we've, even under Mike's figures here, we've shown that 93% of the transactions will not be affected in any way by this action. The only thing that's going to be affected is the 7% of high-end properties, and most of those are hotels and shopping centers and these kinds of things. And that's when you get into that net versus gross, because it's hard to determine what the net would actually be when you talk about a corporate property. And that 7% of sales constitutes for 65% or so of the dollar value. So that's what we was looking at. The sheer numbers is primarily yeah, we got homes at $1 million, but principally we've got commercial properties out there, lots of commercial properties. And these are the ones that we were looking at. Most of them are even off-island properties. So what would be the net? It'd be hard to determine what that would actually be. We know what the gross is.
And Senator, if you just oblige me real quick, Guam Housing Corporation has a couple slides to address what Mr. Beaver was just saying. So if we could bring up the slides now. So Mr. Beaver or Mr. President, please feel free to explain.
I need paper.
Sure. And wow,
So
that is slide 36, I believe.
Yeah, the real estate sales over $1 million constitutes $1.2 million. The number of transactions was 151. As a percentage of the total, that's 4.71%.
That's the wrong slide. 36. Slide 36 first.
No, it's down here. Oh. I'm sorry.
It starts at that.
Oh, okay. Pardon me, can't see the board from here, but the total sales under $1 million, $736,000. Total number of transactions, 3,058. As a total percentage, that's 95%. The total percent of the value is 36%.
And just to, it's 736 million, which is the impact of total sales that are under $1 million. And so it shows the percentage of the total number, which would be 95%. So 95% of the impact is there. And then in the next slide, slide 37, please.
The 2012 to 2017.
I believe we did a 5-year average, so 12 to 17. This is a total accumulation.
Yeah.
And then these are for properties over $1 million. So Mr. Beaver, go ahead and explain that slide, or Mr. President.
Number 37?
Yes.
The total sales over $1 million was 1.2 billion. It's 151 transactions. That's 4.7%. That's 63% of the value. And that's, again, why we was going after the higher-end properties. The issues we had before was we didn't want to bother folks that are transferring property by deed to families or to whatever. We wanted to get, or gifts. We were only looking for the higher-end properties on this one right here. And the records show out. Mike's records show out.
I appreciate the data, Madam Chair. I wanted to just reiterate my query. Are we exempting, or is there, or are these taxes inclusive of estates that are being or have been probated? Because when you probate an estate and the property is transferred or the property is sold, are these including probate estates? Because what's going to happen is, while $1 million property in our mind, we think of a hotel or some kind of large transaction, but sometimes we have family estates, very, very, land rich, but not necessarily cash rich. Grandpa didn't want to divide it up before he died because he doesn't want to split the family. It goes into probate, and the courts order a probate, and it's a $3 million property, and then all of a sudden the estate is going to have to pay a much higher fee for on this, because if we pass this, and so are probated properties included, and is there any specific exemption, or do we perhaps need to also consider that as language? Just wanted to raise that issue. I'm just making a list here, Madam Chair.
Yes, sure.
Another question I wanted to raise was, do these taxes also apply to Guam Housing Corporation transactions? Like the $2.50 fee. Only because, I mean, if we're, one of the ways we can probably try and lower the, lower the costs on the Guam housing transactions is perhaps exempt Guam housing transactions from any of these realty conveyance fees. And then another question I had, this is actually a pretty big one, is we're raising the tax on $1 million transactions, but are we also including like-kind exchanges? Because a like-kind exchange is basically if, let's say, an individual owns $1 million property and someone wants to buy it, but the individual doesn't want to sell it because they don't want to realize a tax liability. And so what they'll do is they'll do a like-kind exchange of the seller who may have another property that they're willing to take. And so it's basically a no-cash transaction, but it is $1 million transaction. And in a like-kind exchange, there's no taxes being assessed, but technically, by the way the language is written here, because we don't exempt like-kind transactions, they may pay this higher tax. As a matter of fact, they probably are still paying the tax in the $2.50. I don't know if they're exempt on that. And so I think we perhaps need to include like-kind transactions as exemptions, because what we don't want to do is we don't want to, if individuals holding large land holdings aren't selling it because they don't want to realize a tax liability, we don't want them to not like-kind exchange it because they don't want to realize the tax liability. So we perhaps need to include like-kind exchanges as an exemption. So just a reiteration, Madam Chair, of some of the items I've brought up. We may want to amend the bill to make it the monies going to the Land Survey Revolving Fund. We may want to consider keeping it at an even $2.50 regardless of the size of the transaction. We may want to keep the language in there that would make it net of encumbrance so that we're not raising selling prices. And we may want to create an exemption section that includes deeds of gift, probates, Guam Housing Corporation transactions, and like-kind exchanges. Also on this exemption, we may want to include affordable housing developments. Because if somebody's building they're taking advantage of all these tax credit programs, they're building these affordable housing developments in order to put, it's basically the same mission. We don't want to be increasing the cost of one mission at the expense of another. So we may want to also create an exemption for affordable housing developments in the statute as we consider this.
Okay, thank you, Senator Nicholas. I believe that a lot of the amendments that you are proposing, we can address those if you'd like to propose them at this time. I think it would be good to at least propose some of them so that we can move forward. And I think that there is some concern with the net encumbrance amongst the Guam Housing Corporation, not so much that they don't agree, but to see if they can have some time to get with their team and come out with a table and get numbers solidified for us so that we can really see the impact of that net encumbrance.
Oh yes, Madam Chair, I actually want to yield these to the committee because I'm sure there's a lot more information that everyone's going to want to gather as we discuss these items. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator Nicholas. Senator Lee?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I believe the retiring speaker may have addressed this in one of his amendments, so I'll just wait to kind of see those details written down. But I also, in the interest of having a broader, more sustainable revenue source for Guam Housing Corporation, which I'm totally in favor of, I'm in agreement that maybe this $2.50 jump to $11.50 is just it just seems drastic in my mind and maybe could potentially discourage economic and foreign investment. And so I'm just a little bit concerned that it seems like a large jump. And I wanted to ask you if at any time the Guam Association of Realtors was able to attend a public hearing or provide testimony, because I'm not seeing that in the committee report. And I think the information presented by Mr. Beaver is extremely helpful to us to kind of get a picture of, the entire industry, and that 95% of the transactions would be unaffected and only 4.71% of the total between the years of 2012 and 2017 would really be affected in this $1 million or over transaction. But I'm sorry, just to go back to my question about GAR.
Yeah, so we did have a number of meetings. The good chair also held roundtables and the like. This hasn't been, overall, extremely popular. But I think what has happened over the months and years, Ms. Guerrero has gone and made a number of presentations to real estate forums and the like. And so there's 2 points I'd like to make. First of all, we're trying to attempt to do something here meaningful, and that's why we made the compromise. When we first went before GAR, the first proposal, they were very vehemently against. As we started to discuss the middle road and the compromise, a lot of folks came on board. And so if you really work within I've done a number of different transactions in the real estate world and know a lot of realtors. Other than the 5 or 6 brokers maybe on Guam who are really the big fish and deal with big fish transactions, it's the little guy out there really on the street that has sold those 585 homes and realized the commission. And so the little guys like the opportunity that's presented here with the revenue and transactions. As far as the homework that I was given to go and speak to brokers and the like, the response that I got was, it's a cost of doing business. I mean, they're not going to say right away, there's not, other than a possible anecdotal statement, there's nothing on paper that says Shin Corporation from China is not going to put $200 million into building a hotel because Guam changed their recordation fee from $250 to $1150. And that's why I also brought up earlier that if the 620 some programs throughout the United States exist still today, there's a reason, because there's an understanding that there's a cost of doing business, and in transactions, governments do things to help their people. And so the fact of the matter is, if that same corporation was going to plant money on Guam or anywhere else in the continental United States or otherwise, Hawaii and Alaska and the like, they would, on a transaction similar in nature, be paying a recordation fee that is much higher than Guam. And so that is the best possible response that we can give, aside from an economic impact study that was done with Clyde and his team as well. We just don't have that overwhelming, this is going to kill the cash cow. So outside of that, we think that this is a good starting point and that this is a fair compromise, given the fact that the net and the yield is around $2 million annually for this program, and that if you look at, once again, the transactions on $1 million and up, we just have not seen any cold evidence or hard evidence that shows, this is gonna be a deal breaker and a showstopper.
Thank you so much, Senator. And you mentioned the compromise. And it's my understanding that a measure similar to this was brought up in previous legislature. Was there a fee that was larger than $1150? I mean,
yes, the original baseline was $500,000, $500,000 transaction.
So you increased that to $1 million.
We increased that to $1 million, and the original recordation fee was $17.50. Anything above $500,000.
That's helpful.
The range that we saw there was, and if you could extrapolate it really over the 5 years data that we gave you and the 4.7%, that was somewhere in the neighborhood of, we saw numbers like 5.5, maybe 8 million, depending on, I think there was a senator who's going to do a reappropriation based on a number of different transactions or talked about it, just with the Cortec properties and other large sales that have happened within the last several months. So the fact of the matter is, you're going to have those years where, the build-up's coming. You're going to have those years where big companies are looking at Guam and going to come out and do some big stuff. And so you know, with those numbers and using these numbers, there was a couple of boom years in there in terms of real estate transactions. Yeah, $6-8 million, some people would hold their nose and go, well, wait a minute, you know, we want to help too, but that, you know, that economic impact doesn't look so good. So when we came down to the 1150 and set the 1 million, it seemed to be a lot more palatable. And if we really go much lower, I don't know that it would be meaningful. Now, I don't want to be the guy to say that, you know. If the body wishes to get a lower starting point, you know, we'll deal with it. But the fact of the matter is that this is the medium that we found.
Right, it's really helpful for us to kind of see where it was initially and then where we've gone to today, and that there was some compromise, that there was, you know, I applaud Senator Nelson and all of you for working with stakeholders in our community to make sure that we have this dialogue and have this discussion before we make these steps. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you, Senator Lee. Is there anyone else? Any colleagues that, yes, Senator Atta, thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to direct my questions, first of all, to the Director of Department of Land Management. And I guess right now the land management budget, annual operating budget, is funded primarily by the fees that you generate from the services that you provide, plus some subsidy from the general fund. Is that correct?
Correct, Senator.
And can you tell me if the department has received the funding that it needs annually to be able to catch up with a surveying of unsurveyed government property, the registration aspects, and the other things that it needs to do to provide the services?
Well, obviously, you know, with the general fund, I mean, we prefer to be divorced from that and to have all our fee schedules to be at an appropriate amount that we're weaned from the general fund and that we can rely solely on the land survey revolving fund. That's one of the reasons why when this proposed legislation was coming forward, we were looking at the increase to $3.50 for those above $1 million in sales, that portion would go up $1 for us, so that we can use that for the land survey revolving fund. Have we received all our funding? Well, we received what we've been budgeted, but it's not exactly what we've been requesting either. So it's been more difficult for us to be able to do a number of the things that we would like to do as far as going out and getting all the lands surveyed. Right.
Now, I know that the department was looking at actually increasing its fees, all its fees, because they haven't been adjusted since, I think 2 decades ago?
Correct.
And so that was actually pretty much in the works, and of course Bill 145 pretty much, was introduced before a bill was introduced to otherwise increase the fees for the department. Has your annual operating budget been sufficient?
No, it has not.
It has not. Now, I've got to say, for the record, as the chairman for the Committee on Land, that this thing is starting to look like the Highway Maintenance Fund. The Highway Maintenance Fund was created. We have the fuel tax to provide money into that fund so that we can maintain our highways. And little by little, we take money out of it to fund UOG, to fund GCC, and then next thing we know, we don't have enough money to maintain our highways. And so what do? We have to increase those taxes, and the cycle is probably going to start all over. And so this is starting to look like now, that we found a cash cow here, and which was originally intended for the land survey revolving fund, and now we're dipping into it for other things other than what that fund was was intended for. So I'm just saying for the record now that I do have reservations about tapping into the basically increasing the fees, and you know, we're basically increasing the fees significantly, and you know, I mean, I guess land management gets crumbs, as if suggesting that, you know, the work that they have to do is not important. Now, I've been trying to follow along the discussion, and quite frankly, you know, these things about loans and whatnot, I'm kind of struggling to understand. And now let me, if I can understand. So we're basically, with this increase that's being proposed, it's going to provide about $4.8 million a year to Guam Housing, correct? To be put into the Housing Trust Fund?
I think the estimate is quite a bit lower than that, Senator. I think it's pegged
Okay,
at around
let me just continue.
$2.1 million.
Let me just continue with my question. So now we found a funding source that hopefully will provide a continuing, an annual revenue stream to put into the housing funds, $4.8 million every year. Now, so that I understand what this is for, this revenue that's being received is to provide low interest loans?
Senator, there, if I could go back.
Sure.
I know where you're going, and I understand your sentiment. I would start by saying this. The trust fund was created by this august body, and the only funding source so far has been the escheated funds and investments from the general fund, which was otherwise placed in to be used, or actually from Guam Housing. Guam Housing is into this program for $500,000 even on its own. So I understand your sentiment, and perhaps the answer to that question is to basically say that this is a separate recordation as a standalone funding source for Guam Housing for these programs. The second is in the wisdom and the desire of the body when it created the trust fund, there are 12 identified program areas for the expenditure of funds. Only one of them is lending capital. There are opportunities for the homeless programs. There are opportunities for possibly reducing the impacts of system development charges and infrastructure. There are a lot of different opportunities if lending capital is not the only wish. And that's why in the language of the Enabling Act as it's proposed, it is this body that will decide where those appropriations go in any iteration of those 12 areas that were also vetted through the AAA process. So it is not simply lending capital, although we now have a pipeline. I think, Mary, the last estimate we had, we have a pipeline of over $14 million of applicants who are otherwise qualified for our lending capital, of which we have probably only $2 to $3 million to loan. So that is obviously an area where we could really help a lot of families with lending capital, but it's not restricted to lending capital.
So off this newfound $4.8 million revenue stream that Guam Housing is looking at getting, if this thing goes through, approximately how much of that is actually going to be made available for home loans? We
will work with this body to determine that. You would appropriate it, so we would have it in the loan in the trust fund, and it is clear in the language of the enabling legislation and the findings and intent that the legislature will decide how to distribute those funds. We would hope that this and future bodies would look to lending capital as one of its top priorities. We would also know that each one of your committees would react to the potential areas where you would help constituents also on affordable housing in other areas. Like I said, Senator, one area that I know is dear to your heart, infrastructure. And so, you know, this capital could be the dedicated funding source for subdevelopments that are going to go in and put infrastructure in for affordable housing. And so these are some of the program areas that this august body could debate.
Okay. And my final question is that what we are increasing is the realty conveyance tax. So we have a bill that is proposing a tax increase, right? And there's been enough things written since the highway fuel tax got passed. I'm just wondering, I noticed there's no language here saying that notwithstanding, I forget what that law was, to basically say, never mind going to the referendum, you know, to get the people to agree to this tax increase. That language is not in here, and so without that language being in here, we're basically then going in conflict with that law. Although I must say this for the record, that I did request for an opinion specifically on this particular tax increase from the Attorney General. And she basically says, well, the previous legislature cannot tie a future legislature from the previous legislature said, if you're going to increase the tax, you have to give it out to the voters to vote on it. And she's saying, well, you don't have to pay attention to that. But that law is still there.
I have seen the opinion. We read it this morning, Senator Ada. But we are also asking for an amendment to be proffered on the floor to strike through and do what the entire language of the bill calls for, and that is a fee. We believe in our research that this is a fee because it's a cost of doing business. It is not something that pertains to the general public at large, like a business privilege tax or otherwise, because not everybody does a real estate transaction. Only those who are engaging in the exchange of real estate that requires a recordation at land management. So this is why we had, after the public hearing, we noticed that was an error as far as we're concerned, the way the bill was constructed. And we are looking to have it changed because we believe fundamentally that this is a fee and not a tax.
So we're going to call a tomato, and therefore we don't have to go out for a referendum.
Senator, the bill was intended from its original inception to be a tomato, so we still want it to be a tomato. We won't say tomato and accept the fact that it's fundamentally different.
All right. Okay, thank you very much.
Senator Lee and then Speaker.
Thank you again, Madam Chair, and thank you all for just indulging me. I have two quick questions. Will any of these funds be used for personnel or operations at GHC?
We are allowed, and thank you for the question. It has only been, I believe, and we have that table somewhere here, it has only been, I believe, in the last 6 months to a year after our promulgation of our rules and regulations for this trust fund that we have been allowed to collect a 10% fee for the management of these accounts and the work that our folks do on a daily basis. I would like to say, and we've done our research and we still can't find, we don't see any other government program that collects a fee that returns 90% of its resources to the constituency. And so there is no, this is not for travel, this is not for new computers, this is not for additional staff. The 10% is a cost of doing business, which our staff will incur additional work in order to manage this fund and all the programs that this legislature decides that we will embark on. And so that, we believe that's a modest return, or actually a modest exchange for Guam Housing doing this project, and we still can't find a government program that returns 90% of the fees that it collects directly to the constituency.
Thank you, Senator. My second question is the Guam Housing Corporation operating in a surplus or deficit year over year?
We are operating at this point basically at a net neutral. We recently had an audit. We're very excited that the responses, I can't do the public auditor's work, but it was a very positive meeting. Our history now is 4 years, clean, unqualified audit. We pray that that will be the 5th year, but that's not official yet. But the audit shows that we're managing our funds very well. We're basically at a net break even right now is what that audit demonstrated. Our weakness is our rental division, where we need to capture some additional revenue.
Sujasmasi. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Lee. Speaker Cruz.
Thank you very much, and I thank the retiring earlier speaker from Barrigada for providing me the segue to what I need to do this morning, whether it's a tomato or a tomato. In the original 20101, the first two words are "a tax is established." And even in the amended version of 20101, it starts with "a tax is established." And as such, since we still have the statute on the books, as the senator from Barrigada has stated, we have to address that at some point. And so I'm going to have to do as I did as he mentioned, in the highway fund. Though I was the co-sponsor of that bill, I introduced an amendment to send it to referendum. I initially had it with the referendum, and when the referendum part was taken out, I withdrew my sponsorship. So in this piece of legislation, for consistency's sake, I have to make this amendment at this point. I have to make provide this amendment, changing the effective date to after it has been placed before the voters in the referendum. And it reads, effective date pursuant to 16311, Chapter 16 of Title III, Guam Code Annotated. The provisions of this act shall not go into effect without the approval of the voters of Guam in a referendum. The manner of which the provisions of this act shall be placed in referendum before the voters shall follow Section 16311, Chapter 16 of Title III, Guam Code Annotated. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Colleagues, we have before us an amendment to amend Section 5 of the bill to read, Section 5, effective date. What is crossed out is "this act shall be effective upon enactment," and what is put in replace is "pursuant to subsection 16311, Chapter 16 of Title III, Guam Code Annotated. The provisions of this act shall not go into effect without the approval of the voters of Guam in a referendum. The manner in which the provisions of this act shall be placed in referendum before the voters shall follow subsection 16311, Chapter 16 of Title III, Guam Code Annotated." Any discussion on the amendment? Senator Castro?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I don't know, forgive me, Mr. Speaker, if I'm out of order here, but I was hoping to adhere to the advice of the professional staff with your concurrence, Mr. Speaker, on another amendment that would simply strike the word "tax" and replace that with "fee." But, I guess I'm it came after the good speaker introduced his amendment, so I don't know if we want to address that first, because if it should pass, this would make that concern moot. It'll be a moot discussion. So I leave that up to you, Chair, to rule. I may be out of order here, so.
Thank you, Senator Castro. We will first address the amendment by the Speaker. Any discussion on the amendment by the Speaker? Senator Espadon.
Madam Chair, just by a visual inspection, there are 5 members of this body who are not present. I believe that they should be present to at least discuss it and to ultimately vote on it. It wouldn't be right for just 10 of us, you know, since again, we know the concerns and we know the concerns of the community now, you know, in terms of increasing taxes, right, and whether or not this should go to a referendum. I believe that the other members of the body should be here to be involved in this discussion as well as this vote.
Thank you, Senator Espadon.
With that, can I suggest that we recess until after lunch and get all the members here so that everybody can vote on it then, to 2 o'clock?
Thank you, Senator Espadon, and thank you, Mr. Speaker. We will recess and reconvene at 2 o'clock. Thank you.